For 200,000 years, humans shared everything. Then, one person built a fence, and someone else decided to tear it down. That sounds like a simple story, but it might be one of the most important moments in human history, even though we will never know exactly when it happened or who those two people were. What we do know is that somewhere along the way, humans went from small personal fights to something much bigger, something organized, something with leaders, weapons, and armies. We call it war. And to understand how it started, we have to go back to a time before fences even made sense, a time when the idea of "this land is mine" would have sounded strange to almost everyone alive. For most of human history, people did not live in one place. They moved. They followed animals, followed the seasons, followed food. If a group of hunters had a bad week, they walked somewhere else. There was no reason to fight hard over one patch of ground because the world was big and nobody owned it. You could argue about a hunting spot, sure. You could get angry over an insult, a stolen partner, a broken promise. People have always fought each other, but these fights were personal. They ended when the anger ended. There was no reason for one person to organize 50 others to march somewhere and fight on command. Why would you follow a stranger's orders to risk your life over a piece of land you could just walk away from? Then something changed everything. Farming. Around 10,000 years ago, in a handful of places around the world, people discovered they could plant seeds and grow their own food instead of chasing it. This sounds small, but think about what it actually meant. If you plant a field, you cannot just walk away from it the next season. You have to stay. You have to protect it. You have to defend the ground your food is growing in. For the first time, a piece of land was not just a place you pass through. It was your survival, tied to one exact spot on the map. One of the best places in the ancient world for this kind of farming was a region we now call Mesopotamia. If that word sounds complicated, here is the simple version. Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers. Picture a long strip of land in what is now Iraq, sitting between two rivers called the Tigris and the Euphrates. Those rivers flooded the land with water and left behind rich, dark soil, perfect for growing crops. In a part of the world that was mostly dry desert, this strip of land next to the rivers was like discovering a green oasis in the middle of a wasteland. People noticed. People came. And once they came, they stayed. Now imagine you are one of these early farmers. Your entire life depends on that river. Your crops need it to grow. Your animals need it to drink. Your children need the food that water helps create. This water is not just a nice thing to have nearby. It is the line between eating and starving. Now imagine another group of farmers sets up right next to you, drawing from the same river, wanting the same fertile ground. At first, maybe you share it. Maybe there's enough for everyone. But what happens in a dry year when the river does not rise as high as usual and suddenly there's not enough water for both of you? That is the moment a neighbor can start to look like a threat. Villages along these rivers grew bigger over time. A small farming settlement grew into a town. A town grew into something we would now call a city, with walls, streets, temples, and thousands of people living close together. These early cities each had their own ruler, their own gods, their own identity. Historians call them city-states because each one acted almost like its own small country, even though many of them were closer to each other than some modern cities are to their own suburbs. You could sometimes walk from one city-state to its rival in a single day. Two of these city-states are especially important to our story, Lagash and Umma. Lagash and Umma were neighboring city-states in ancient Sumer, which was the southern part of Mesopotamia. They were close enough to share a border, and that border ran straight through a stretch of farmland that both cities needed. This land had a name, Guadana, which basically meant the edge of the plain. Whoever controlled Guadana controlled valuable farmland and access to canals that carried water in from the river. In other words, this one strip of dirt was the same as controlling food and water for thousands of people. For a while, this dispute was handled the way disputes were handled everywhere at this point in history, through agreements, boundary markers, maybe even outside rulers stepping in to settle things peacefully. Ancient records tell us that at one point, a king from another city was asked to act almost like a judge, drawing an official line between Lagash and Umma, and setting up a boundary marker so both sides would know where their land started and ended. For a little while it worked, but agreements like this depend on both sides continuing to respect them. And borders drawn by one generation do not always feel fair to the next generation, especially when a ruler decides that the official line does not match what they believe should belong to them. Over time, the peace broke down. Rulers of Umma began pushing past the border, farming land that had been declared part of Lagash. From the perspective of Lagash, this was not just an argument between two farmers arguing over a fence anymore. This was one city taking something that belonged to another city, and when land is tied to survival, an insult like that does not stay small. It grows. This is where the story becomes something new in human history, because Lagash did not just send one angry group of farmers to yell across the field. Lagash organized. A ruler could now call together large numbers of people, arm them, train them into formations, and command them to march toward the disputed land, not as individuals settling a grudge, but as a unified force representing the entire city. Think about what this required. Someone had to design and produce weapons in large numbers, not just for one fighter, but for hundreds. We actually have physical proof of what these early Mesopotamian soldiers looked like in battle, thanks to an incredible carved stone monument called the Stele of the Vultures. It is one of the oldest known pieces of art that shows organized warfare, created to celebrate a victory by the ruler of Lagash over Umma. On this stone, you can see soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in tight, straight rows, holding large rectangular shields that overlap with the shields of the soldiers beside them,